minutes that were posted for review today, and we didn't really get any, only had one comment back on one of them, so we made that, and then, I mean, it was a spelling kind of thing, so I think we're okay with those anyway.
I looked at it for just review of the content and the themes, and it seemed, I didn't
Okay,
find
and I'm
anything.
sorry we were just so late in getting a bunch of them, but we'll get all those approved, we'll get them in to put them on the portal tonight or tomorrow. Next, I just want to touch on the executive summary. We made some updates from the last version. Chris put it into a much nicer format for us, and then I sent that out. Any issues or questions with where we are with that? That's still a living document, so after today, anything else you have comments, get them in, as soon as possible, but take a couple of days if you still need them. Like we talked about the expanded summary on the kind of the research that was done, the backgrounds and the people's background, the team members' background, so we can get that included in the package. And then the next thing I'd like to do is just kind of go through, kind of the start of the slide deck to kind of point out the things where we're going, and it gets really kind of tricky toward the end as to how best to portray what it is we want to portray. Because if we try to portray all the various options that we looked at, obviously it gets pretty difficult, and then you have the limitations of what we can show on the board versus what we want to have in a hard copy handout. Anything with a lot of numbers, you'll see is some are impossible to see on the board. We try to scale it down as much as we can to get them readable. But just kind of walk through the slide deck and then comments on anything in particular. But when we get toward the back, especially on how we want to go about presenting what our recommendation is, which what assumptions we want to make into the the rate study objective, the rate objective tab, specifically with respect to general fund support, that kind of thing. So then we know what the numbers the numbers are for the comparison charts we want to show. So without further ado, Matt, you said you can see the slides we're working on. Okay, all right. So again, a bunch of happy to glad stuff up front, just kind of give some background. That was kind of, I took as our mission, kind of the mayor gave us that at the very beginning. We can take that, again, all these things will be available for comment, and they're on the share drive, so you can kind of look and edit as you see fit. But, the things that jumped out at me from the listening to the minutes and looking at the minutes, the fair and equitable thing, and then not trying to protect or favor any particular group, just come up with what we thought was reasonable. A couple of things that we stressed early on. One, we started with the Abraham's report, which was done in the fall, which had a bunch of the data collection analysis done. We wanted to make sure that we covered all of our costs, both O&M and CIP. Had to be technically sound, sustainable over time. We wanted to look at that whole, it turned out to be about a 12-year window that we ended up looking at. Wanted to make sure we were covering all those type things, make sure we're including the debt service. That was a big chunk of what we're doing. Some sort of fee or whatever for system access. We had ultimately turned that into a ready to serve kind of thing, and then we wanted to have a usage fee or consumption fee, which, as we all know, kind of developed into where our real focus was. We wanted to go using usage as kind of our main criteria. Wanted to make sure we took into account the seasonality of our community. We wanted to generate public and expert our technical kind of support for what we've done. And if the opportunity arose to simplify the process, then we'd want to do that as well. Here's a little bit about our team. We can talk about kind of the experiences of the group. You'll see my bias, obviously, having grown up at the end of the alphabet. We're listed alphabetically last and down to first. W to D. Okay. Just to kind of bring everybody up to speed on our water system, kind of show, we want to talk fact. We do North Shores, we do a bunch outside the gate, to include Breezewood and some of the closer in. So it's not just the city of Rehoboth. Kind of just give a kind of a number of kind of users we have. Show that there's our big number, 5,300 or so users, and we actually service more people outside the city limits than we do inside. Same kind of deal on our sewer, bring in the fact we do North Shores. There's kind of a snapshot of our sewer collection system. And talk about kind of who the big users of our sewer system are. I want to add the volumes into here, so we have that. Same on the water side. Get a better understanding of the volumes, just for everybody's kind of educational thing. I was going to go through some of the existing conditions, at our wastewater plant and the collection system, as well as at our water treatment systems. So I got some good photos, got some bad photos, but just wanted to highlight kind of the general overall nature of our systems. Same for the water side. We talk a little bit about some of the facilities we have and have to maintain. This was the water service line from Commissioner Sharp's house. She doesn't really mind drinking all that stuff that comes out of her pipe.
I know you're kidding.
I am kidding.
Excellent. Thank
It was
you.
out of a, it's a new house at Oak Street, so we had to replace the water line. But that's typical. I mean, that some of these older things that have been in the ground since 1930 or 1940, that's a galvanized pipe, which fortunately we don't have a lot of, but it gets pretty nasty and corroded over the years. And what used to be probably a 3/4 inch line or a 1 inch line is probably a 1/2 inch line by the time, and even less when you consider all the leaks that are in that service line. But again, just kind of going over our facilities and kind of the general status of how we're doing. I want to touch on the rate history. Bert dug this up for us, kind of the history of our rates. The increases over time. I want to talk specifically to the surcharge and the fact that it was targeted to anticipate some of the costs that would be associated with the outfall. And it's been at the 50% level for the last 7 or 8 years, 6 or 7 years, I guess. And we'll talk a little bit more about the balance of that as we get going forward. Again, the current situation.
I'm sorry, go back to
Yeah.
the brief. It's just a little confusing to me, the surcharge.
Sure.
Not really following the same columns as above, and I know you're maybe trying to break it up.
I was trying to make it so it fit, yeah,
Right.
because they don't really align with the
Right.
meter size.
Exactly.
Would it be better if it's just one all across the bottom?
Yeah, or just maybe 2 separate tables on the same page so you can have different headings or something.
Okay, just try to look at
Yeah.
that.
But if we can not take numbers reversed,
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
That's a good catch.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's an important little detail. That's a minor detail there, Mike. Thanks. It's funny you would say that because on one of those side spreadsheets I was doing, I had carried in the reversed way, for weeks. And at one point in time, it dawned on me that hey, they don't look right. But you look at them so many times, you
That's
just
right.
kind of get numb to them. All right, so this is just going to talk about how, here's where our current situation is with our projected revenues and our projected costs. And obviously, there's a pretty good delta in here with respect to shortfall on revenue coming in. And this is wastewater, we'll do the same. This was a question for the group. Here it is with the actual numbers. Same chart, one with the data table, one without. Do we like it with the table or without?
Like it was.
They're both readable, I think, scale, so we'll leave the one in with the table, use the data table.
It'll appeal to
Yep.
how people like to.
I thought it was
look at
nice.
it.
So again, it gives you real numbers. Yes, sir.
Just a quick point, if you keep those numbers and you're missing a number at the end of those, so actually in some cases you're missing 2. You might need to get those in
Okay.
there to make
All right,
it clear that we're dealing millions of dollars today.
okay, I got you. Good catch.
You could also, shorten it up as long as it's consistent, but
Yep. No, and I think it's very readable at this, so we could get a number in there without any trouble. Yeah, so and here we would want to talk to, the big increases. I don't know whether we talk here or somewhere else, but the big spike brought upon by the, starting payback the SRF loans, But the big spike is a result of having to pay for phase 4 wastewater treatment plant upgrade, out of capital outlay as opposed to borrowing. And we'll talk a little bit about the borrowing in a minute. There's kind of the water side, same thing, two of the same. We'll do the ones with the water or with the data table in there. But again, just all kind of current situation, why we are where we are, and why the rate study group came together. This talks to a little bit on our borrowing capacity. We have $75 million debt limit, and you can see the various loans that we have. So the ones that are most applicable, obviously, are the SRF loans, because we have some remaining capacity. Bert's done an analysis on, do we have enough within our debt limit to be able to take advantage of the remaining capacity in the SRF loans. It looks like we do, because as we pay some back, we get more capacity to do some of the work. So when we set the workbook up and said we were going to do phase 3 with the remaining SRF funds, this helps us understand that, yes, there probably are enough funds to do phase 3 remaining and still staying underneath the debt limit. But there's not any for phase 4, and we'll talk about that.
Yeah, Kevin, I think
Sure.
it might be worth just noting that the larger loans have exceedingly favorable interest rates. That if the city didn't have as good a rating as it does, we'd be paying a hell of a lot more for the funds that we needed.
Okay. Yeah, they are pretty good rates.
Well, there's another point too, in that I checked, the City Hall loan is through USDA. There's no prepayment penalty. So whereas the SRF outfall loans, there's a prepayment clause in there. The School View Sewer loan has no prepayment. And I contacted DNREC today because we have the Lynch well, and I didn't have the bond on that yet, a copy of the signed bond. So they're going to send that to me, but we'll check that. I guess really the whole point of this, it gives us flexibility. If we were approaching a debt limit, we could use our funds to reduce the City Hall loan, or reduce one of the other loans. So
It's pretty neat with the 2% loans. Who would want to repay them early?
ordinarily we wouldn't if it wasn't for the debt limit.
For the debt limit, yeah. It causes us to want to do
Yeah.
it.
Because we're getting paid on our cash by the WSFS 2.2%. So
And there's been some slight changes to wastewater treatment plant phase 2 that we'll talk about at the working group, or Monday's a working group. So we'll discuss that at the working group meeting with the commissioners. All right, so now we're getting into kind of the guts of our work, and okay, how do we come up with what we came up with? So we had some assumptions going in that we used. Obviously, we have some existing agreements with some of the communities we serve, mainly the county, Dewey, Henlopen and Acres, those kind of guys. And then on the water, the North Shore is Breezewood and some. I don't know that there's an out-of-town agreement. It's but we have kind of a standard operating procedure with them with respect to our multiplier and those kind of things. So although we didn't necessarily make all these assumptions at the beginning of our work, over the course of the group's meetings, we made these assumptions that we didn't really want to go back and try to renegotiate these agreements at this time. We got away from using the meter size as a differentiator as who our customers were, because we realized that 89 or whatever % of our meters are all 1-inch meters. So to use that as a differentiator kind of between residential, commercial, or whatever, it was a kind of a meaningless thing for us to do. So we kind of got away from that. Here's where we talked about the borrowing capacity. We did assume that we had $10 million going to be available to us for the phase 3, so then Matt has built that into the workbook, and that we did not have borrowing capacity for the $14 million for phase 4. So then that's built in as a capital outlay, which helps drive that big spike in the mid-years. Then and this one? No. Okay, so then now we begin the guts of our thing. So if you go back to our first couple of meetings, kind of one of the things we wanted to do was research other communities in the area we ultimately went not just area, but around the country. Somebody, I think Roger maybe found that study that was done in Florida. Obviously, a lot of beach communities down there. And there had to be 150 probably communities in there, and we used them. And then each individual went out and researched a handful of communities as well. We brought all that back and then used that in our decision-making process down the road. We had a couple of industry manuals that guided our efforts, the AWWA manual as well as the Water Environment Federation manual. We use both of those.
You want to spell those out?
Yeah, I will. Yeah, that's a good point. Tell them what they are. Some other things we looked at, did we want to have a minimum usage fee? We ultimately decided we didn't want to have a minimum fee. We ended up with a ready to serve, but did we want an did we want a ready to serve fee? And if so, we wanted it to be based on something concrete. So we decided we would use that to try to recoup our administrative costs, which is a very common thing in the industry. So we ultimately decided to do that. And then our philosophy became very clear early on that we wanted the people that were using more to pay more. And, if you use more, you pay more kind of philosophy.
Yeah, hey, Kevin?
Yes, sir.
It may be silly, but I think under the consumption fee, it may be useful to start out with use less, pay less, use
Okay.
more, pay more,
I like that.
just to get people thinking with the mindset.
Right. Do more with less? Do more with more. So we ultimately got in, as I said, we collectively decided on having a ready to serve fee. We looked at various options on what we would try to recoup with that, what that should really be, what a reasonable amount would be. So we went and looked at what it would be if we looked at accounting for all of our costs, our administrative costs. So we did that. So just a quick other question for the folks here. One of the things I thought about doing is if we need to, at any time, jump into one of the workbooks to kind of show that, where would we want to do it and if we would want to do it? Because it's very hard to maneuver within the workbook, but if there's something we wanted to go to show that, like, do we want to jump into the admin cost allocation tab and show, here's where we broke all those out?
I think you should hold it off till later. You've got a nice flow here.
Yeah.
I think
Okay.
Mike's right on there, because if you start flipping around and it
It's gonna be
doesn't come
tough.
up and say, well, okay, somebody says, I want to dig down and see the raw details.
Right.
We
Now, what I
can
could do is, if you think it would be warranted, is take just a small snapshot of a piece of it, because you can blow that up, throw it into the PowerPoint, and you would see, as an example, here's 12 of the rows that, is
Yeah.
90 rows long.
I like that.
So maybe show it, and I even thought maybe here, you could even fit it into the slide next door. Here's a snapshot of a piece of that cost allocation tab, and throw that in
Just
there.
have to say, example of some of the
Yeah,
things.
but not go back and forth into the workbook.
No.
No, I think you're getting, it'd be a little dangerous to do that, but I think
Yeah.
one point, Matt is on what, version 33? Is he on 33 or 34 now?
Still 33, I think, yeah.
And I guess my point of it is it might be something you want to impress upon the public, because we didn't just go ahead and do a single pass. We
Yeah.
looked at this a lot.
Maybe I'll do that back when we talked about the resources we used. We used Dave's report. He built the workbook, talked about how many versions we've been through on the workbook. Maybe it had. Okay. All right, so we're developing our ready to serve fee. So we looked at a couple of things that we found, techniques that are out there in industry being used. We looked at just recovering it, by the bill. And we just multiply it, by take the administrative cost, divide it by the number of bills, and hashing it out that way. We looked at, and we finally settled on an equivalent meter philosophy or method and the capacity. So what that involves is you take each of the types of meters you have, how many of them you have, put that against the whole system, and you get an equivalent meter based upon their capacity, and that capacity is measured in their maximum flow rates. So that gives you an idea of the flow. So in our method, the equivalent meter by capacity method, basically a 6-inch meter counts as 20 1-inch meters. And then that goes into this table, which then kind of breaks out. There's the administrative costs. There's the number of equivalent meters we had. So you get an equivalent meter cost of 126.98. That's an annual cost. So then you divide that into the number of bills that individual would receive. And then that ultimately determines what their per bill ready to serve fee is. And there you can see 1-inch meter in this particular case with this set of assumptions was $31.75. 1.5 was $21.16. The thing to point out here would be that anything above 1-inch meter gets paid 12 times a year. The 1-inch gets paid 4 times. So even though the 1.5 meter has a per bill charge less than the 1-inch meter, which would seem odd, but over the course of the year, it's still about twice what the 1-inch meter pays. So it's better to look at the annual yearly piece because that normalizes it across all of the bills.
Do you mind going back a couple slides where we first introduce ready to serve? I think it's so. I'm just trying to make sure that I'm not caught up in, we've been talking about this now for months. If I'm seeing this for the first time, is it beneficial to put a definition of what ready to serve is? An attempt to, recover, it's a fee to attempt to recover. I mean, maybe it's just
More
expanding
on the bullet.
more on the
Sure,
bullet.
absolutely.
And then when we go to the next page, we talk about the ready to serve methodology. So again.
The different options we looked at. And then
Right, so, and maybe I'm just making it too verbose, but the intent was, all right, so it's to capture and cover administrative costs, okay. And the revenue recovery.
You're always moving me along, saying move this thing forward.
Yeah, you're right. So where it says revenue recovery, unless this is just your prompt for your voice track, we may want to say, three methods discussed for revenue recovery: per bill, equivalent meter cost, equivalent meter capacity. I'm just trying to set it up, and then go into the next one.
Okay.
Which is the deep dive definition.
Yeah.
Okay.
That shows how we get the equivalency and then plug that into this table. And as
I'm
you can
just
see, a
wondering-
lot of work still on the formatting of the
Yeah,
tables because
good.
Excel doesn't pull into PowerPoint very well. But I can make the table in PowerPoint. It looks a lot better. Some of those I've done already, some I haven't.
Yeah, I think it's a big jump from the previous one into this because this becomes somewhat of an eyesore.
Correct, and I can trim that because all this stuff squeezes over because you've just seen all of that, and then you can really look at what it is per each meter size.
Okay, good.
Okay, and this is where we get into our methodology for determining what our rate was going to be for the consumption. And we talk about, the seasonal demands. We know that. So we looked at our fixed costs, which we applied, and the terminology was very loose. I don't think Bert's accounting world would call the things we called fixed costs necessarily. But we looked at what it would cost us to run the plant full year at kind of the off-season volume. And we tagged those costs against what we called our base flow. So we're calling those fixed costs against kind of our base flow. And then the incremental costs or non-fixed cost, we applied against our seasonal increase, kind of what we called our peak flow or incremental flow.
But I thought we talked about not using the terms fixed and non-fixed and changing it to base and incremental.
We can. It's littered throughout a bunch of places.
It's called search,
Yeah.
Yeah, the only thing.
replace.
Yeah.
Well,
The only thing I would
Yeah.
say to that, Deb, in the accounting world, maybe you won't have any accountants at the meeting, but in the accounting world, fixed and
Right.
and non-fixed means a lot.
Right.
They understand that. Now, I don't know. I think it's fixed and non-fixed is very explanatory personally.
I don't, because when I hear the non-fixed, I want people to know that the non-fixed is taking into account what we used to consider the peak stuff. So to me, that's what incremental. The base represents if the cost, if we only had to service, you know,
So I think that's on me to do a better job explaining it
okay.
and how we interchange the terms.
I have no, I
Mike, do you
mean,
have an opinion?
right,
or-
yeah,
Or somebody else.
I don't have,
It's
I
an
mean,
area that's been perplexing from the beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah,
And
it's whatever you want to call it. I
We're
mean,
getting
as long as
closer.
it's explained, I mean,
I just always think about when that document sits somewhere on a table and someone picks it up, can they understand what it means? And I don't know that us saying fixed costs, non-fixed costs truly defines that it's the baseline base and then the incremental for the influx of
Okay.
people.
Well, that's what I was trying to do with the first
Yeah,
bullet
right.
under it.
well, I think
But maybe I don't
either
tie
term
that
you
well
use,
enough.
either term
In
you
trouble.
use, I think you're gonna have to explain it.
Yeah.
So
Right.
pick your term, I don't care.
Well,
I think it
we-
helps introduce the concept.
We
of
bounce
raising
back and
it.
forth,
Yeah.
obviously, in our various documents, but, you know, basically our year-round flow is our base, and we tagged our fixed costs to that, or that we called our fixed costs, the cost of servicing that base flow.
And I think one of
Something
the
like that.
examples you might use in explaining it, like chemicals and electricity,
So, do a couple
perfect
examples.
examples. And you
Right.
say, we're gonna use more chemicals if we had no part-time residents or peak periods,
Yeah,
you know.
okay.
Okay.
I think the examples might help.
Yeah. By the way, I just got a message from DNREC. There's no prepayment on the Lynch well, so we've got 3 loans which we could use to pay down. So we could pay down the ones with the highest interest rate, which, you know, they're all pretty low.
So then the question would beg, out of all your different emergency funds, how much?
Where would you get the money?
Yeah, where do we get the money to pay them down?
Well, I mean, it depends which one you're gonna pay. If you were gonna pay the city hall loan, you would use money from your general government, and, you know, we have accounts for there.
How about
The fact that we can do it
the
makes,
Bert Dukes account?
well, you can call it whatever you want to call it. Just, when I retire, just make sure I can take that account.
Okay.
No, but I mean,
Yeah, no, I understand.
we have flexibility. is the
Well, that's
message.
important because we made some assumptions, you know, because of that. Okay, so then just spelled out kind of our peak and non-peak periods, and then maybe another shot over here somewhere of our cost allocation tab to talk about some of those examples and show some of those numbers that we used. In this case, this one, the CIP was really the big, the CIP costs here were the big drivers on those. Then we took, okay, so now we classified our costs against which type of flow it was, and we had a fixed rate component of our rate, and then we had did the same type thing with our peak incremental flow, and we developed a non-fixed component of our rate, and then we determined our consumption rate by summing the 2 components. That's what we did. A couple of other things we entertained is, and Matt in his workbook has been able to make those variables so we can, once we decide, or things that we do decide, we can put in there and try in different ways. And over the course of that, we kind of came up with, we definitely wanted to have reserve funds in both water and wastewater accounts. And in looking at documentation, they gave us some kind of ranges of either 1 to 3 months kind of reserves, or for an operational reserve, or a capital reserve that looked at fixing what would be kind of a major end item that would happen to fail during that period of time. So the committee came up with a recommendation of about $300,000 in each of those. For the wastewater side, using the same philosophy, we kind of came up with $100,000 for each on the water side. One of the other things we recognized is that because of that surcharge we had been collecting for a number of years, we have a surplus in that surcharge account of about $1.5 million. We had discussed whether or not we just wanted to keep that as an emergency fund, or do we want to use that $1.5 million in order to bring rates down. Our decision was to go ahead and apply that, and I think we spread that in $250,000 increments over the first 6 years to help bring rates down for the ratepayers, and not to keep that as a big chunk of a reserve.
You might explain on that, if you want, that what that means is that's the extra 50% that we've been
Yeah.
getting on our bills.
Yep.
So people can connect with where that money
Sure.
is.
Okay.
And that wasn't random, we gave it some thought.
Okay, excellent. Some more of the options we talked about. We looked at, kind of what we call a variable rate, where we would bring in enough revenue to pay for each year's worth of bills. We thought that created some issues with kind of predictability and large movements, both up and down later on with those rates. So in order to get a little bit better predictability and consistency with our rate, we wanted to look at various level rates. So you develop your rate over those various terms. We looked at a 2, 3, 4, and 6-year options. Our group has settled on a recommendation for a 4-year option, and most of the comparisons you'll see throughout the remainder of the presentation will look at the variable rate, because that's the straightest dollar-to-dollar comparison when you look at what rates were and what they're going to. But then you'll also see a 4-year look to see what that rate looks like over that 4-year period. We also suggested or recommending that at the end of the 3rd year, by the end of the 3rd year, that you reconvene a rate study group made up of 7 different people, and you look and see if those assumptions and decisions we made this year still hold water and are good to continue, or it gives us kind of a built-in recheck mechanism to
Yeah, I'm looking forward to doing this again.
Mike, I want you there, Mike. I want you there. One of the other big things that we really spent a lot of time discussing was the general fund support. As many of you know, over the course of the recent history, we've used a significant amount of money from our enterprise funds, both the water and the wastewater enterprise funds, to pay general fund expenses. Very common throughout the country. Certainly, we have the history of having done that. Bert has kind of come up with on average, what we have used for general fund support between the 2 funds over the recent years, and I think it was on the order of about $700,000 or $800,000 a year over the past 10 years or so. And Bert, you can feel free to kind of opine as to the goodness of that.
Yeah, slightly less, but you're.
Yeah, so 700,000. So it's going to come into play when we ultimately decide what numbers we want to plug into our method, our rate calculators, because that impacts what each of those rates turns out to be. All right, kind of bring us back to current situation. Here's what we look like on the wastewater side, current situation, obviously with our big gap in between our revenue and our cost. Here's kind of what that chart looks like if we match it year by year. And using a 4-year level rate, here's what those graphs look like. You'll note that it's not a 4-year, this does not really show the rate. And I've got a note here, I want to have a table in there that shows what that rate looks like. We have some other options with graphs to show that. But as Matt reminded me many times, because we're also bringing in additional revenue increases from our other ratepayers, not just our ratepayers, but our other customers, that are going to, their piece is rising as well. So all those increases are not just captured by our individual ratepayers. So those numbers, but that's what it would look like with a 4-year stable rate. Obviously, the area, if you go back to your calculus, the area under the curves better be equal. And we talked earlier when we looked at these about the cash flow piece, and we were able to make that work.
Yeah, this is Zach. Can you go back to that previous graph, please? Well, first off, down at the bottom, you can see that where it says expenditures and revenues, that's kind of hiding behind that little table there.
Yep.
So you consider fixing that. But one point about this graph, so when you look at this, you can still see, though, that it doesn't really appear like revenues are covering the expenditures, especially in the middle part there. So even with the rate setting, it looks like it's falling short. Now, I think the reason why is because the rates have been calculated assuming that some of that sewer surcharge money is going to be used, and that surcharge money is not depicted as a revenue here. So that's why there's a little bit of a gap. I think if we were to include it, then you'd see the lining up much more so than you do here. So I'm interested to see if when we get to water, I'm assuming you have a similar one for water.
Right.
I'm guessing we're going to see the lines much more in line than what we see here. So
Yes.
if that's going to be trickier, if that's going to raise questions, then we should somehow get that in here, or maybe have a note that says this doesn't account for the presumed use of X amount of dollars out of this sewer surcharge account, something like that.
Okay. I would prefer if we can actually input that and show it in the graph. So the graph, because, we went through this a couple of months ago with, we really worried about our cash flow. It says we're not bringing enough in early to cover that one section at a time. And then you were able to use that surcharge and apply it maybe a little differently.
Do you want to show maybe a third line that's a different color, that's revenues and surcharge combined, or?
I'd like to just build it, add it into the spreadsheet. So you have a table that brings those funds in to show the better alignment. Because our plan is to use them. That's why we kind of came up with that. And it does bring our cash flow to the point where we are able to pay those bills when they happen and not, 3 years or 2 years after. So just think through, is there a way, because I'm with you, I don't necessarily like showing, because it does look like it's in deficit. But I think we're solving that problem through the use of the surcharge. So if there's a way to build that surcharge into that graph, I think that would be the best way to do it.
Well, go ahead.
The audience for this is the workshop
Yes.
Monday.
So no. It's going to be a special meeting, which will probably not be on the 12th now for several reasons. But yes, the special meeting.
And are you going to expect commissioners to hold their questions?
Commissioners can do what commissioners want to do.
Well, because the first question I had, Dee already went right to it. That the story of this chart is telling me is that we're still not meeting our expenditure.
Okay, right.
So I would have interrupted you already at the beginning of that chart and said, what's wrong with this?
Okay.
Well, Deb had the idea, go along with that too. In other words, if we had 3 lines, revenues, expenditures, and
then one including the
surplus
surcharge.
cash, because we're basically going to use the money that we've accumulated in prior periods, and we previously reported that as revenue. So we can't report it as revenue again, but it's a source of our funds to be used.
And I think then that helps justify the purpose of the surcharge
Okay.
on this chart.
I can buy that.
Well, it's also a reality, because irrespective of whether you chose 1, 2, 3, or 4 years as a time period, that money is still there from an accounting standpoint that can be utilized within the system. And so you would like to utilize the system over a period of N years, so it should be reflected here. Otherwise, actually, I think you're actually presenting something that is not reflective of what's being done.
Yeah, and if we throw that money into the revenue line item, you're distorting what the true amount of revenue is. So I think if we can fit it in there, I think Commissioner Sharp was right on the money, because that's the first thing I looked at,
Yeah. So Matt, is that something we can do fairly easily?
So Kevin, you do want to include or you don't? Because I heard differing opinions there.
No, I think we do.
I think what we want to do
How
is,
we want to show it is kind of the discussion point, and I think the group here is thinking that it might be best to show it as a third line that shows including the surplus, because I'm with them now that we don't want to show that as a revenue because it's not a revenue, right? So using the surplus then would then bound, that third line would show much tighter to the anticipated expenditure.
I don't know how you want to present it, Matt, but basically, whatever difference there is between revenue and expenditures, you could plug it with that surplus cash. But I don't know. It's whatever you think's appropriate. It's clear to people.
Okay, well, we can try a few different things and see,
Okay.
and see what's preferred.
Yep.
But yeah, in order to implement that, not difficult at this point.
Correct. Okay, good. And this is kind of just in tabular form, and again, it didn't quite come in as clean as we would like, so we'll dress that up. But again, it shows, you know, the kind of the 1 year variable rate comparison against the 4 year level rate. And as you can see, you know, if you just did the first year, you know, it's kind of misleading because you 859 for the usage rate, and then it's 1399 on a proposed. And you know, really, you can bring in, because you see that large increase going on at about years 3, 4, and 5. This brings some of that forward, so it's a little bit bigger step, you know, in the current 4 year term to reduce the larger step in the 5 to 8 year term. This is where we get kind of flaky as to what graphs we want to show where. But this is just kind of to show as a comparison of using our recommended 4 year terms. And you looked at, you know, the blue is what it was in 2018. The orange is kind of the interim rate that went into effect with the 30% water and 60% wastewater. And then this is the first of the the gray is the first of the 4 year terms, the blue is the second 4 year term, and then the yellow. So you can kind of see the step up based upon your usage rate. And in this case, these are all 1 inch meters, and then they're used at various flow amounts. So there's 4,000 gallon usage, 20,000 gallon usage, 40,000 gallon usage, 80,000, and 100,000. All 1 inch meters. You can kind of see the various steps. And as you could have seen from the graphics earlier, the bar graph or the line graphs, you can see that, you know, that second term in this case jumps considerably, because that's where those big expenses of the capital outlay for phase 4 really hit. And then I want to add those, you know, we had another chart for 1.5 and 2 inch, and another chart for larger, and we'll throw those in there as well. Same kind of thing on the water side. There's kind of our current situation again. You know, here's where our projected revenues are, and there's our projected expenses, and you can see again, the area under the curve is significantly deficient. So there we look, there's what it would look like with the 1 year kind of variable rate. So it's a pretty tight shot group there. And then there it is with our anticipated or recommended 4 year term, and they kind of level out.
Go back to the first
Yep.
one, just, okay, thank you.
Yeah, much more level in this case because there's not a big spike with the CIP, you know, the large CIP expenses, like we have in the wastewater. So in my own mind, this is kind of back for the group again. When we show these, is there any goodness in showing, you know, kind of what, again, we'll have the numbers on there, but do we need to show or talk to any of the specific things that are driving? Like there's a nice spike there because of some work that's going to go on at a couple of our wells. Do we need to talk to any of those or have examples of those, or we just look at this point looking at the kind of the trends and the numbers?
I'm gonna ask you what the spike is about.
Okay, so we'll have that answer when you ask,
So,
or present it, right?
Yeah, I think it's a talk point.
Yeah.
I don't know that you gotta mess up the chart
Yeah,
with
you
a
just
lot
talk
of.
about it.
Talk about it. Okay.
X millions of dollars for Y purposes on
Yep.
on the well.
Yep.
and I'm gonna ask you in the year 2027, I believe, on that? Yeah.
What did we miss? Yeah.
Why are we intentionally dropping there only to go right back up in 2028?
Yeah.
Man, just speak to it.
Yeah.
Just speak to it.
Okay. So while we're talking about that, as a commissioner, would you want to kind of go into a discussion very early on back in the development and the resources we used, talk about the asset management plans and the work that the commissioners had commissioned with our consultants that developed a kind of a 12-year, 13-year plan for our operation and maintenance of our facilities. I mean, that was the base document that kind of drove when these projects happened. Do we want to talk that early on to just kind of bring that back to the forefront?
For me, I can only tell you, in about the first 5 or 6 slides, you're talking more about what you decided to do than why you decided to do it. And so I'm gonna be interrupting you, saying, why?
Okay, remind me to say, hold the questions till the end.
Well, that's why I asked you, and I don't know how you could really handle that, but
Okay.
it's always an option, you know? But I wanna hear a little bit more about why you've made certain consensus
Okay.
recommendations.
Yeah,
So maybe it's just as you kind of set the stage for the presentation, you're gonna go into the methodology and kind of the decisions made, and then delve into more detail as to why.
I think the why.
Let me get through the first 5 pages, Tony, and
I will
then.
be very, very controlled.
Sure.
Kevin, I think that Tony brings up a good point, that I think in those
Don't
first
encourage,
few
please
pages.
don't encourage her.
Nick,
Please don't encourage
No.
her.
It's from the standpoint of doing exactly what you just did.
Yeah.
But I think you can interject as you're showing those graphs, which are very specific, as to the reason this conclusion was reached is because
Okay.
the system has an estimated life of X. The following systems degrade over time, and at this point, we're so many years into, and so you can do it just verbally, without having to show graphs of all the charts and numbers, and it gives people a flavor that, oh, you know, the system has a certain amount of years
Tell
associated
the
with it.
story.
Yeah.
Tell the story.
Okay, so now we're back on track here. Again, we have the same examples that we've been using throughout, this time now on the water side, and you can kind of see what happens in our 4-year terms. A little smoother than we had on the wastewater side because of the lack of these large capital projects. This was just a note. We liked it. I think we agreed we liked the data table below, as long as it's still readable. So there's our 1-inch. I thought I had the. Okay. Oh, there it is. It's larger than 1 inch. All right. So this is our 1.5 meter at 19,000, and these are annuals. And this is 1.5 inches at 104,000. You kind of see the impacts on those. There's 2 different 2-inch meters, one at the low end of our 2-inch range and one at the mid to high end of our 2-inch range. And you kind of see what that looks like. Next, we have the 2 comparisons on our 3-inch meters, just kind of give it an idea of the increments on our 4-year terms. And then this is a 4-inch plus. Up until now, we've really only categorized things as 4-inch and larger. I think our recommendation going forward is to go ahead and classify the 6-inch as a 6-inch. And we did that in our equivalent meter methodology we talked about earlier. There's obviously one of our largest users and that's actually a 6-inch meter there. All right, so here's where we really get into hard things to visualize. So, you know, we have a lot of spreadsheets. So that's what that looked like bringing it in. But a summary table kind of looks like this. So I think we've got to go with a summary, knowing that we have that, you know, the full table in the back if we need it. But just a straight 1-inch comparison to where we would be. This is after our recommended rate, where we would still be with respect to some local communities or communities around us. And we looked at on the water side. You know,
Can we put something like that in a chart? I just think graphs, art, some kind of chart is something pictorial is better than an actual table.
I always think the numbers kind of spoke volumes here, but
I kind of thought that too, but.
well, maybe we do the chart on the table.
Yeah, you do the same format
Yeah,
as the
table.
other ones.
Yeah.
Guess I'm a picture person.
What I'm wondering is on the chart, should we sort the numbers from high to low? So you can kind of see where we rank in the stack.
Yeah.
Sure.
Is that something you have to do, or does Matt do that?
It's called
Well,
select all.
yeah.
Sort
I mean, that I think
based on column A.
I know,
yeah.
but it's,
No.
I'm giving somebody work.
No, and it doesn't matter whose it is. If it's going to be better to do it, then we're going to do it. And Matt and I can sort it out.
Well, you think it's a good recommendation?
Yeah. To do it in.
Yeah.
Okay.
See
So
who's
we're always
the
at the
highest.
bottom, except for Georgetown.
Well, I guess what I'm saying
you
is
put us at top.
if you might not need the chart if you had it sorted in an order, because you'd see that Rehoboth
Sorted
is,
low to high.
yeah.
Yeah.
All right, so
Ascending order.
we'll look to put that in a graph and put the data table at the bottom, and then we'll list them in order of, or in,
And maybe just make
Sequential.
Rehoboth a different color also.
okay, all right. I like all those.
Hey,
Yeah.
I used to be a consultant, I can do PowerPoint charts.
Yeah.
It's all about how it looks.
What did you just say? No, say that again. Wait, say that, where's the microphone? We're recording it. Say that a little
It's all
again.
about how pretty it looks.
No, they say you used to be a consultant and you did, right?
I did lots of, I got paid by the slide.
I know who I'm calling. Yeah, I'll see you tomorrow. I love those ideas. And put it graphically, we'll do it high to low or low to high, whatever.
Seriously, I mean, I'll help you with that stuff.
So we have a bunch of different ones of these to do. This is where I wanted to talk about, does it make sense to try to put them all into, a series of charts? Or do we have kind of, because we have it in a one pager that we could have as a handout to the folks, or both. So create multiple slides that you can read,
I guess my,
specifically looking at 2 inch, inch and a half, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch. I like that.
I'm of the opinion to say, all right, this is what 1 inch looks like, but we have the detail on
Right.
other size meters if anyone's
I go with
interested.
the one slide and have the detail for everybody else.
I think everybody's
Everybody
interest
else
is the
gonna
1
be a
inch.
minority.
Right.
Yeah.
The majority is
Okay,
the
so
one
we'll
inch.
do that. We'll focus on the one, have the others as a handout.
As
in the package.
needed type thing. Someone asks, you got it in your back pocket.
Right. Okay, so now we get into the discussion about the general fund, support to the general fund. So, we can really play with this and get various options from folks, or do we pick one and go with it? And if we pick one and go with it, which one? Because it obviously impacts every other table we have in the presentation in the workbook, because, not the workbook because it already has them, but in the presentation, because, if you change that from one to another, it changes our recommendation
Well, no, I
numbers.
think, don't you want to stay consistent to one inch meter and just have that be the discussion throughout? Is that what you're?
No, I'm thinking the support to the general fund can
Right.
range from 0 to whatever.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So that's one of those variables that we input early on, but whatever we put in there changes every one of these slides. So we had talked about showing it in 0. So we could do a 0 comparison, water and sewer, what it would look like with no general fund support. Or we kind of thought, you max it out at about 500 each. So do you do the low and the high in each one? Or how would you like us to attack that? Commissioner Sharp.
I'm not telling you how to do this.
No,
I think-
how would you like to see it? Mayor, how would you like us to present it?
I would think pretty close to where it's been over the last 10 years.
So if we try to account for about 700K between the water and sewer, is there any preference, evenly split? 4 on water, 3 on sewer, something along those lines? 5 each?
I think more towards sewer.
Yeah, I would think it'd be weighted more on the sewer than the water.
Okay, 4 on sewer, 3 on water?
Sure.
And you can always back it all.
Yeah, exactly right. And
And again, I think that talk point is that's a throttle or a lever that can be played with that the commissioners can then discuss amongst themselves
Right.
what the right number is.
Sorry, Kevin, you've already covered this, but does Y have some special dispensation? They pay slightly more than in-town people, but less than North Shores Green?
correct, they have a kind of yes. I think we bill them at the 1.5.
My son has a $20 a month membership for basketball. I had no idea. So that's just the Y, no
Just
money in that
the Y,
city.
correct, just the Y. And I think they have 2 meters out there. So, yeah, because I was going to try to avoid that question by just taking them off, but I forgot to do that on this one. I think I took it off on a different one. Okay, so just so you get the group gets kind of an idea, this is water with no support to the general fund, and if you just looked at the The usage rate, it's $4.70 whatever cents, six. So you throw 500,000, which we thought would have been at the high end, it goes to 573. So that delta is, oops, sorry, about $1 per 1,000 gallons different to contribute $500,000 to the general fund. Seems almost insignificant, doesn't it? Yeah.
And that's,
If you're a water user,
Mhm.
and based on current external agreements that exist, what the external user, such as Breezewood, pays is a function of the rate that the Rehoboth resident pays for water. And there's no differentiation of how that per 1,000 gallon charge came about. It's just whatever it pays, it pays. So that means then technically, and I'm not getting into the legal issues, I'm just discussing at least what I know from what I read. That means then if the water bill was to reflect all of the contribution to the Rehoboth Beach General Fund, more people would be picking up that contribution than just the residents of Rehoboth. Did I make myself clear?
Yeah, and I think you're right on that, Mike. I mean, we're in the water business, and we sell at double the rate, and we have more revenue from out of town than in town.
Right.
So it's clearly generating revenue that we can use to support.
Right, so what I'm leading up to is, when the resident looks at their bill, you have water and you have sewer, but the sewer keys off the water. And so it would make more sense, because we're in the water business as Rehoboth Beach, to take and put all of the contribution to the general fund against the water. Because the water is distributed to more people. And so therefore the impact is less to the Rehoboth individual user. So there's a benefit. So my recommendation as a member of this committee would be to, it makes it easier to, from the standpoint of rather than splitting things up, is to put it all within the water and have that be the recommendation, that the contribution to the general fund of X dollars is all within the water component of it. And the reason behind that is it's distributed against a much larger base, which is not the case for the sewer side of the business.
Well, when we first started talking about this,
do we have the ability to do that with the Breezewood and the North Shores agreements?
well, they don't, I mean, basically, their revenue is gonna be based on their multiple of whatever we establish.
Well,
But going back to what Mike was saying about the sewer piece, I mean, we weren't really talking about much contribution from the sewer to the general fund because of the debt load that we're having to cover. We would, already make a situation that's gonna be more costly, even more costly by adding too much.
Right, but it was what we were just talking about on the slide before of how should we weight, if you will, the contributions to the general fund, and that's where you just wrote down 4-3, right? So now we're saying, no, we're not gonna split it between the two. To your point, you don't wanna add more to the wastewater side anyway.
Would
So
we
now
want
we're
to
saying,
table that thought right now, and when we finish with the presentation stuff, we can actually pull the workbook up and kind of show what those differences would be.
Well, we'd say, yeah, one thing too, the final decision as to how much contribution we want to make is going to be made by the commissioner. So
Right.
we're just putting our number in there, and
right, but I
But
like,
because it's so impactful on the rest of the presentation, you got to have a pretty good idea what you want it to be.
I agree.
okay,
Right, well,
Well, it's definitely,
I mean, my proposal is how should I say this? It's based on the fact that we're in the water business. I guess that's what I'm looking at. And since we're in the water business, it makes more sense to distribute the expenses associated to the largest base that you have. Now, that's strictly a policy perspective, but I think that's a recommendation that I would, as a member of this committee, would like to make when we go before the commissioners.
Well, and I think you
Take a
can,
little different tack.
I think you can support that, Mike, by saying our rates are already competitive
Right.
with the other communities, so
Yeah.
we don't feel like we're taking advantage of anybody because
No.
our out-of-town customers are still paying less than our.
Significantly, as shown by that chart, the two charts previous.
There's a question out there.
And I think if you look at,
The mayor had a question first. You had your hand up at one point.
Yeah, I agree now with what Mike's saying, because if you think about it, there are twice as many water customers as there are sewer customers. So rather than spread 400,000 over 2,800 sewer customers and then only 300,000 over 5,400 sewer, water customers, if you spread the whole 700 over 5,400, I think that's the way to go, because as
Yeah,
Bert
so I see
said,
what you're saying. You're gonna need to see what the impact is on the rates, because then it affects all the
Yeah.
other charts that we
Right.
looked at.
it just affects the presentation.
Right, absolutely.
I don't think it affects our recommendation
No,
one way or the other, but
but-
yeah. So, and just as for a scale, this was with 500, and we're saying maybe take it to 700.
Right,
So right now it went up just under $1, right? So the
Right.
previous slide was 476 and this is 573.
right.
So maybe it goes up another
Buck
25 cents. So at let's call it 6 even, right? $6 even per 1,000 gallons. I thought I had picked it up. So somewhere in here I have the various, what that would do compared to everybody else. All right, so,
still up there.
yeah. Tidewater's still at 821.
Yeah.
I pay 821. Okay, so,
Yeah.
all right, so we'll do that.
Probably cheaper than getting your own well put in and then having to have a filter put in to get all the iron out of it.
Yeah, that's true. And same kind of thing on the sewer side. So this is what it looked like with no support to the general fund coming out of the sewer. And we were at 14, and if we did 500 into the sewer, it
And
was
now you don't have-
16 cents.
you don't
So
have to
now
So now
that
we don't.
takes that out of the equation.
I saved you a chart.
Sure did, save money
Mm.
for the people in town.
Absolutely right, yeah. That's why we love Mike. So yeah, this was another one. This is where I kind of mentioned it earlier. Do we need to show those kind of numbers as to where it is? I think the consensus was no, right?
No, but I think that back to Tony's point, that's what you weave into when you first start to lay
Correct,
this
yeah.
out as to why are there changes, because
Yeah.
we're looking at $14 million in 20X, et cetera, because of the aging of our infrastructure, blah, 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 and a few specific examples, which people then can key into that and say, oh, yeah.
And just off the top of my head, I'm thinking it's in. You know, we kind of talk about here, when we're talking about the shapes of the curves, kind of talk to the reason. I mentioned the big spike because of we kind of talk that all the way through. Okay,
Right, but
I'm with you.
even earlier, you're going to sort of set the stage for that. You'll go into maybe a little more detail here verbally, but you'll at least set it, as Tony said, why did you make these, how did these assumptions come about? Why did you make these conclusions up front? And that's the lead in.
Okay, then I guess all that would turn into one slide at the end that combines kind of the water and sewer, into, yeah, it's probably better off going the other way. That kind of comes up with, here's the recommendation. You know, here's what the rates
The
are.
final look is.
Right.
Yeah. All this tied up in a bow looks like this.
That would be the last. Instead of this, there'll be one slide that kind of shows each of those rates. Or maybe it's two, maybe it's these two. Here's what the sewer rate is going to look like, and there's what the water rate's going to look like.
Do we, not knowing the full format for this, but do we want to have, you know, we talked about doing an FAQ. Do we want to have any FAQs in here, like, you know, or have a separate sheet ready for the FAQs that goes back and says,
Yep.
why aren't we using peak, even though we've talked about it?
Sure.
Or,
Yep, and Bruce had started that. I think we
Right.
sent that around. We're down to, we got like 5. So if anybody has any suggestions,
And I think
questions and answers.
part of what I have to do is a revamp
Yep.
of what I did previously. It talks about that as well.
Correct, yeah. So yeah, I love the idea of it. We need to know what those questions are, and we can develop the answers, so.
I think
Come
that's
up with some
probably question number one is, well, why not a peak and non-peak? And I
Right.
think we discussed that. Mike did a good job, kind of helping us through that. But that's good. And then another question I would think of, when you see that hump in your chart, somebody's going to say, well, why are you funding that internally with your rates and not the debt? And then you're going to go out to explain we have limitations on that. So the hump in the chart, I think people might want to know, how come? Why don't you smooth it out more? If we could borrow money, we could, but we can't.
We'll ask you to take Mike's, add it to the bottom of Mike's, and then recirculate it to the group. So all these ones that you come up with, I'm not capturing them to
That's
add
okay.
into the Q&A or the FAQs.
We're hoping.
No, I'm not. I'm telling you, I'm not. So write the question, write the answer, send it to us, and we'll merge them all together. Right? Even if you're duplicating somebody else's, we'll
Right.
We'll purge those.
Right, that's good.
You can't show that all on you.
No,
Okay.
not taking it. No, not taking it. All right, so I'm going to make a note on the FAQs because Bruce did a nice job on his first couple. He just kind of ran out of time. I think that's not working.
Yeah, I started some on the executive summary.
Correct, and I think he used those and grew them a little bit.
You got a question, Ken?
Yes, sir.
Maybe in your wording, like your statement, we will attempt to answer it.
Okay, yeah, good point.
I'm sorry, Walter, I didn't hear that.
We will attempt to answer the question.
Yeah.
You're right.
Might not satisfy everybody, but
Yeah, you're right.
What's next?
Good. All right, so that was it on, anything else on the kind of the presentation? All right, so
Good.
we'll work on it.
It's a lot. I mean, it's a lot for,
Yeah, I didn't see the number. It's gotta be 30, 40 some slides, right? 50, we're up to 49 or 50. And we added several, yeah. Yeah, so we're gonna be a couple hours at a special meeting, for sure.
Just a curiosity.
Sure.
So is the intent for this presentation to be the same with the audience in mind of the general public?
Yeah.
well, it's a special meeting
So everybody's-
to focus solely on this for the commissioners. This is the rate study who's been meeting for months, the recommendation to the commissioners, certainly to the public as well. So, I mean, some of the public has participated for a few months, but very few. And obviously the emphasis is going to be a explanation and a detailed discussion, but our charge was to come up with a recommendation after the 30 and 60% was introduced by our consultant, Mr. Abrahams. So, that's what we're doing. This is a culmination of all those meetings, and hopefully the commissioners will have enough information to be able to decide and take a vote so we can move forward.
So, yeah, if I could just add, I would hope after it's presented that the commissioners are gonna say, man, what would it look like? What would it really look like if you did, 500 and 500, we added to whatever. And we can run those. I don't wanna do it, I hate to say it, I don't want it in a public setting because it just bogs us down to do that. But if any commissioner has a question about what would it look like if you did 200,000 instead of 500,000, then we can do that. And then if you ask that question, then in the follow-on meeting before you vote, it'd be very easy to have those answers. As opposed to trying to, at the working meeting, if you said, well, what's it look like with 200,000? And then we're pulling a workbook up and you've seen the water workbook can take 5 minutes just to load.
And
So I would try to avoid that.
I just want to be clear that my concern is more the public, or equally the public and the commissioners. Because when you talk about the percent of 1 inch meters and how large that is, and I think about The only thing that the 1-inch meter people know
Is their bill.
is this. This is the extent of the knowledge for most people in our community. And this, from when I paid my last bill, tells me that my sewer rate is $3.10. So I believe there may be a problem with this because this is a non-peak bill, and I believe if I did the math on this, which it didn't because it's not all that much money, I believe that rate is $2.10. So
are you
all I'm saying is I'm wondering, as you get your words together to go with all of this, the backdrop for me, for the community, is this is what folks know. And this is the extent of it. So how you bridge the gap from all of the extensive work you've done and your recommendations and your justifications, the starting point for me, for most people, is nothing more than this.
Oh, that's an excellent point. And maybe it's we show, well, here's what a current bill looks like, and here's what the future bill would look like for this person. And then call out, these are where things are going to change on the bill. So you're no longer going to have something that's going to say peak or non-peak, or this rate was this, but now it's this. No, I think that's an excellent point, because the only thing people look at in their frame of reference is that bill. That's the only touch they have.
Yep, and that certainly simplifies it. We've been talking here for an hour and 20 minutes. This is the simplified, perhaps, explanation that the public, like yourself, would want to see. But I think there's a simplified version, and this is the detail.
Yes.
We have to get into the detail, obviously, so we can try to make sure everybody understands it as best they can.
So maybe that last slide, the catch-all slide, says, hey, here's what the bill used to look like, and here's what it's going to look like.
Well, that was one of the things I had said earlier. I volunteered so you could actually say my name. It says, here's what Mike Strange previously paid. Here's what Mike Strange is going to pay in this case. So it becomes real. That it's a real bill, a real 1-inch meter, and a typical year-round resident.
As a follow-up, to Tony's point, I think it's a great one. In any building where it's a collective meter, people know even less than that. Like in an 8-unit condo building,
They don't know anything.
it's incorporated into their condo fees. And because I find this, because my background's in economics, I find this subject sort of interesting. I was doing some Googling, and the EPA did a study in 2015 that when folks have a collective meter rather than like an individual sub-meter for each of, say, the 8 or 10, they show that at a minimum they use, when they get the individual meter, they start using at a minimum 15% less water than when it was collected. And some studies have shown that water usage can drop in, say, an 8-unit or 10-unit building as much as 30%. So I think there's going to be an issue in this town of conservation, but it falls maybe to the larger buildings where they're going to have to say, gee, our condo fees are going up like crazy because we're now confronting the city's substantially higher water and wastewater rates. What can we do to reduce people's consumption? Even though unfortunately, economically, we all know they don't have as much of an incentive to conserve when they're paying collectively, and their neighbors, they can't control what their neighbors, what tenants use. So I don't know, there may be some education needed for people who never even really see those bills.
Well, but I think it supports your initial theories and assumptions. The way you structured this whole thing is you use more,
You pay more.
you pay more.
Right.
It's not up to us how much you use. You use more, you pay more. You use less,
You pay
you
less.
pay less.
But
Very simple.
some of the major condominium units, I think, are probably going to be happy with the pricing because the ready-to-serve fee, which was previously maintenance fee, is less. And, I think our mission And we approached it from the cost side and built it up from there, but I mean, we couldn't justify the, what, $685 a month or $650 a month that we were charging some of these places. Where an individual resident was paying $12 or something for a quarter. Really.
Is the special meeting that's gonna be scheduled, that's strictly an information gathering meeting? In other words, we're gonna present our data. The public will be here to question, the commissioners will question, but it's not a decision-making
No,
venue at that point. It's
No,
strictly inbound.
correct. We're hoping that decision comes 10 days later,
Okay.
or within a 2 to 3 week time frame. Or if another meeting is necessary, a special meeting for more explanation, we'll do that. But the intent is to have this in place for the next cycle.
So we're targeting the
Next bill
July
cycle.
board meeting, which is
Yes.
the 19th of July. So that was the genesis of the note today, to look at dates prior to that. So in my mind, in case the commissioners would want a comeback informational brief, we do it at the early end of that window, so if they need something in the middle, that we have a date that we can come back to them. And obviously, they want as many from the group present as possible, which is challenging in and of itself. So we're trying to work those dates. So we're going to get the new date based upon when we can have the most people available. Then we'll find out from the commissioners if they're available to sit on those days for a special meeting. So we're targeting the July 19th board meeting for the vote.
So the goal is that, what is the date that when you turn your faucet on in your home, the rates would apply? What's that date?
What's the quarterly cycle? So
What is
So,
the date?
so Kevin Williams would say, and
Yeah.
one member of the group, Kevin Williams would say that it becomes effective 1 July. It's effective for water use beginning 1 July.
But you would vote on it at the July,
Right.
3 weeks in.
So it would have to be, in order to make the billing,
Retro.
to make the August bill, which pays for July usage, is kind of the window.
See, they would have the bills read sometime middle of July, late July, so there's enough time to do that. And then you're gonna still have monthly bills.
That's the hope. And if that's a bridge too far, then the first that would go into effect would be 1 October. Because we didn't want to charge commercials, the month of July, a certain rate, and then everybody a different rate in August, just be too cumbersome. And, the sense of urgency has come off a little bit because we've already implemented the 30 and 60%. It was really, that was the critical piece for us, to buy us time in order to come to the number.
But I would imagine that one thing we should probably have prepared is, for the commissioners, is what is the ramification? So if it doesn't get voted in to be retroactive July 1, and it has to go October 1, what are the financial impacts to the model?
We can come up with a rough number for that.
Right.
Well, because I can tell you ahead of time, just so you know, I would probably have questions about a retroactive increase. Something that's completely within our control,
Right.
a retroactive increase.
Well, I think we discussed that at one point.
Yeah.
Are we reconsidering then April 1st,
No.
or maybe you
No.
decided that?
No.
Okay, a lot of my neighbors will be very happy to hear that. Has that been announced? Did that letter that you sent in March announcing the 30/60 effective April 1st, has that been announced, that's been changed to?
No, that has not been changed. I thought you were asking, are you
No,
going to
it's in
change
effect.
that?
It's in
1 April is in effect.
Okay.
Yeah, in effect. So the 36.
That's the concern of people, that it's felt as though it was imposed in a way that, since you're still debating the actual rates going forward, it still feels retroactive to a lot of people, although they won't see the bill till late July or whatever.
But that was never the intent. I mean, the intent of the letter was to advise folks that we needed to get, based on the consultant's recommendation, and a lot of information gathering the past year plus, they were the numbers that we needed to associate with an increase. P.S. We're doing the mayor's rate study group coming up with further recommendations. So nothing has been finalized, certainly that's up to the commissioners. So there was not a subsequent letter to the 30-60% letter. There will be, hopefully.
I want to be sure I understood your question. We'll read the meters for the period of April through June. We'll read those meters and send the bills out. So they will be billed at the new rates, April 1 for April. Quarterlies are going to be April, May, and June. So
Those interim, they're called
The
interim
interim
rates, so they will be in effect, those
Yes.
interim rates, okay.
I don't see any reason why they couldn't be. If we're going to go ahead in July and the meeting goes and everything's approved, we'll have the meter readings for the first quarter of our fiscal year, April, May, June. We could bill them at the new rates then.
Yeah, that's what we plan.
Okay.
Wait. You're saying new rates. Let's be careful. Okay, there's the interim rates, which is the 30-60%. What are you, and then there's the recommended rates.
I'm
The
saying
April,
recommended
May,
rates.
June, what rates are you saying people would be billed at?
The proposed rates, not the interim rates. Because we will have agreed what the new rates will be.
Right.
And if the timing goes right and you approve it in early July, we don't send the bills out until second, third week in July. So there's
Late July. And
time.
that's not necessarily going retroactive. It's just in
Consumption.
line with our quarterly billing period, because we're always doing it 3 months
Right.
behind.
Well, it is retroactive because people don't know what the rates are at the point when they're using it. Not that I don't, but that's for
I think-
you guys to
But
decide.
that's
That's
what
not for me to
we've heard a
decide.
lot of complaints about.
I think we'd be very hard pressed to get the rates input at the new rate. If we don't approve it until 19 July, and then we got to get a resolution approved, so we could have all that ready to go with those new rates already in there, assuming everybody's going to approve it, and we do it. Do you think we could? She hadn't started preparing bills by the 19th of July for April to June.
I mean, it's easy to change the number in the bill.
Like a
So
different
it's no problem. The hard part is reading the meters. That's why it takes.
Right, but that happens the last week of June, and the bills go out the first week of July. So
No.
okay.
No, they're red.
We wish they did.
July 28th, we got one in 2018, I mean,
Yeah.
that happened to, I brought it one time, ours was dated July 28th, 2018,
Yeah, right.
we're a quarterly customer, but.
If you get it in the third week of July, you're getting it about where it usually falls. So
I-
bottom point, I guess one point is, are you finding that people want to defer this into the next quarter? Because my feeling is, and I'm saying this as a ratepayer, I'd rather take my poison as soon as possible and get it going, because I'm just going to have to pay more.
Well, what we've heard is that people are basing their rental fees for their homes and everything, I assume the hotels are, on what they know from last year is this year's bill. So kind of they're going on what they expect this year's to be based on what it was last year at this time. So now that if you come in and you increase it by 60% or more, they're saying that they won't have time to incorporate that 60% increase in their water and sewer bill into the rate they charge for their homes or rooms. So they're saying that they need more notice. You can't just tell them on the day you're sending the bill.
The 30-60 notice went out the 1st of April.
That's what I'm saying.
It did, and the 30-60 notice was a part of when they voted to do the ocean outfall and whatnot. That was always the way it was talked about doing. So I agree. I don't, but they're saying they didn't know that. They're saying they didn't hear that discussion. So the people that I talked to.
Selective.
I think that it's an interesting discussion on that, and relates back to where we got to with what we're recommending is a 4-year consistency.
Correct.
So that it allows people, I don't care who you are, to really plan. Now, in most regions and areas and all the work that I did, you'll find pillar to post with the philosophies of longer term, shorter term, month. I mean, they just do it whenever the hell it goes up, bang. Retroactive. I mean, there's so many different things in there. And having been a former rented homes in Rehoboth Beach that I own, you had to give your best estimates of what you think was going on. Was the electric bill going to go up? Was the heating bill going to, whatever the hell was going to happen with AC, et cetera, and sewer and water rates. And sometimes you misestimated. And I think that's a degree of uncertainty that's basically moral hazard.
I certainly doubt they're gonna run it along, operate it along.
As soon as the ocean outfall pipe was finished, I knew it was gonna go up. We had to pay for it.
Yeah, but, and of course, the hotels have already, they've
They
booked
should have
months
booked it,
in
yeah.
advance. And
Some have.
they,
I know millennials who literally book at the airport for that night that they're staying over wherever. So yes, a percentage have booked in advance, but, you know, but the letter we got in March, and our neighbors, one of our neighbors called it the mayor's love letter, actually. He has a sense of humor. But yeah, the concern I have is that they were announced as interim rates, but if you're saying you will set them again, and it sounds like there might not be enough time, that the April, May, June period may have to use those interim rates. There might not be time to put in the new water and wastewater rates for
that
the
depends on
end
the political
July.
process, not the operations part. We can plug those numbers in a couple hours.
Yeah, that's just a matter of changing the rate on a program that generates the bills. But what they're saying is that the interim rates would never take effect. They would just go back to August 1st and put in the new rates.
We already voted that the interim rates
True,
take effect.
true.
So that's not on the table. Those rates were voted on publicly,
But weren't you saying
taking effect April 1.
They're already being charged
Yeah,
in commercial accounts.
they've already been charged?
Oh, well, yeah, right, the monthly customer.
Right.
So we would kind of have to go forward with the rate charges, not back.
Well, I mean,
So the question-
I think we're on a quarterly kind of discussion, because once you do that first month, commercials have paid for April at
What
a
you're
rate.
saying is
We don't want to change their rate.
you can begin the quarterly rates, if they vote on it in July, when you send
Start
the
that July
first
1.
quarter, first fiscal year quarter for Rehoboth.
That's right.
Well, but I don't think that's for
not our,
y'all.
that's right. Like I
This
said, it's
is
a
not
policy
for
issue.
you.
Yeah.
It's purely a policy.
I'd
issue.
step away from it.
I'm trying to, but y'all keep
you're
going
right.
back there. I'm like, what's next?
So can I change the subject? I have a question about something earlier. The last page on your presentation, when you do the 1 year comparing the current bill to the new bill. If you could also do, not every one, but a bill from the larger users, because one of the concerns is, are the 1-inch meter people getting the same percentage of increase? So if I take last year's water bill and compare it to 2023, let's say, would that percentage of increase in that bill for a 1-inch meter be the same as for a 3-inch meter or a 2-inch meter customer, or the larger users, maybe by gallon? Because
Yeah,
the concern is that the
it's
people
not
that use
based
a
on
lot.
meter. It's not based on meter size anymore.
it's based on flow. So as long as everybody's getting the same at each incremental increase.
It's the same.
Yeah, but
Right.
I really think you have a point there, Gary, in the sense that the ready-to-serve fee used to be the maintenance fee.
Right.
Basically, that it's a flat fee. And I think that if you look at some of what the 4- and 6-inch meters paid, that it is a lot less.
Yeah.
So they may have an argument there, but the counter argument
That's
with
what
that
I'm
is
hearing.
we've been charging them too much based on our cost analysis, more than we could really justify. I mean, they've been paying their fair share and more for many years.
So based on the flow, they were paying too much, and now you're bringing them into line.
No, I'm not talking about flow at all. I'm saying, because everybody's going to be paying the same flat rate, okay? We're going to have one rate, but what's going to result in those percentage differences that you're talking about is the flat fee that's associated with each bill, what we're now calling the ready-to-serve fee. Because the ready-to-serve fee, percentage-wise, is going to be probably higher for the smaller meter. For my increase on my 1-inch meter is probably going to be higher than a condo unit, because but people say, well, why? And that's basically because the cost analysis we did with the incremental costs, that breaking out the fixed cost or with variable costs that we couldn't really, or incremental costs, we call it, whatever you want to call it. We couldn't really justify that ready-to-serve fee being that much higher based on the additional costs that were incurred by the presence of these people. So that's.
For example, you take the Henlopen condominiums, roughly 120 units, I think, or
Well, Henlopen, I found out last night, there's 147 units in there.
They get one bill. They only deal with, the city only deals with one person.
Right. It's in their fees.
Right. And so the amount that they pay for getting that one bill on a ready-to-serve basis currently is exceedingly high. Where if you had 120 individual residences, you'd have to read 120 individual meters, deal with 120 individual people. And so when we looked at it, and looked at all the other approaches around the country, it got back to ready to serve. So in essence, the Henlopen Condominium Association on a ready to serve basis is going to pay less just on that. However, the per unit cost, use more, pay more, and they use a ton of water. And so that's where it goes up. So what you see is a change in the ready to serve, which had no rational basis, quite frankly, in previous history. And it was really done to the benefit of residents and the disadvantage of the larger organization that didn't have a rational base. And so you couldn't justify it factually. So based on the evidence, we went in the opposite direction, which is based on evidence and based on not what everyone else does, but it turns out it is. It's a more rational base that can be justified based on the evidence. So that's the very long, convoluted answer. But you pay more, use more, you pay more.
Yeah, the
Absolutely.
connection between, you can almost say, I think you can argue there's a connection between the incremental costs and the ready to serve.
Right.
So you're truing up the ready to serve, which is, I understand. But the flow, if you just look at the flow chart, is it percentage-wise uniform for all the meters?
Well, we're gonna have one rate, so it's.
One rate for all meters.
For all meters, yeah, no
Okay.
matter how.
It's
big.
volumetric based. I mean,
Okay.
Flow rate.
One
Yeah.
flow rate, one flow rate.
So
you
to
can only
say
get
it
so
more-
much through a 1-inch meter.
Right. So I mean, it's gonna be different, yeah. But I mean, the same rate would apply.
So to say it more simply, for 1,000 gallons of water, I pay the same for that 1,000 gallons of water for my usage as the Henlopen does for that
For their
1,000 gallons of water.
Right.
That's right. But I mean, I think you guys have done a great job. You've put a lot of work together, a long time, and it makes sense. And now I
hope so.
can also help to tell people about it and answer some of their questions and help people.
But that's the example that Mike just talked about that comes in, like, it's in the first 6 slides somewhere where you talk about the ready-to-serve fee.
Yeah.
And that's the verbiage as to why it's now been reflected on, it's now more accurate, and going forward, this is how it all becomes equitable. Yeah.
One more comment that you might want to address in the question and answer section. People are saying to me, why are we smoothing or spreading the revenue out equally amongst 12 months when we're a seasonal town and we get most of our revenue in the 3 months during the summer? So what you're asking people to do is in January, February, March, when they're basically getting no revenue in, to pay a higher bill than they normally would to maintain their properties, and then they can pay a little less in July. So, I get it, I'm an accountant, you put money aside for the slow months, and you don't spend everything you take in on the busy months, you gotta save some for the slow months. I get that. But there's a lot of people that don't get that, and they're saying, why don't we just keep it so that the bills are low during the winter and go up a little bit during the summer when I've got money coming in and I can pay these higher bills? Because I'm gonna spend every dollar I get in the summer, and I won't have any money in January, January, February,
So my
March.
argument with this, Gary, and I think you really, you got a little bit of a, we've got a little bit of a challenge here because you have a mindset that people say, I love the peak and the non-peak because
Yeah.
the guy that comes down for just a season, we're hitting him hard and he's kind of carrying us a little bit. Well, is that really fair? That would be like me saying, okay, you live in Washington DC on Block A, and your neighbor lives on Block B, but because he travels overseas a lot, we're going to have a different rate for him to sock him a little harder than the guy that's in the block over there. That's essentially what we're saying. We were discriminating.
Yeah, but they're viewing it, so Washington DC is like a 12-month community. People live and work there all year round.
Right.
But for here, it's a unique resort, seasonal town, and we get pretty quiet in January and February here. So,
Yeah, we can't, we cannot have this both ways.
we can't have it both
We
ways.
can't have it both ways.
That's right.
And I'm
That's
gonna be very vocal that, in one breath,
That's
you
good.
cannot say we are a year-round community.
That's right.
And in the next breath, you say we're a seasonal.
So that's a good way to sell it. We're
No.
trying to move towards a year-round community.
Well, why should your rate be changed based upon the time of the year that you're living in Rehoboth?
If you tie it to revenue flow, that's what they're tying it to.
Their
Who's
revenue.
revenue?
Their revenue flow,
As if-
yeah.
As if the revenue flow
Yeah.
is the responsibility of the city.
Right?
Give me a.
Well, no, they're not saying it's against the city. It's just saying recognize what type of city we live in. We live in a
We live in a
resort
year-round
town.
community.
Well, there's people that say, no, we're just a seasonal beach town. And,
But I mean, discussions of electric
Well,
rates
it's
too,
way
the
out.
same deal, like there'll be, there are 100 different views about what's equitable. And those of us who live here year round would obviously prefer to see peak rates imposed, from whatever, April 1st to, even October 31st versus the other 6 months of the year, but it turns out people's behavior, is unpredictable on this anyway, and I'm
And
not
I gotta
sure
say-
we're able to do that peak, non-peak for water.
and I gotta say, I'm just telling you what I've heard. For me, flows are gonna drop in January and their bills are gonna be less anyway. Flows are gonna go way up in the summertime when they're renting their houses and their bills are gonna go up. So it's all gonna be the same. In my mind, I'm just saying, this is what I hear
Well, it's
people
good to know
say.
what people-
Well, there's,
But I mean, it's all based on flow and flow's gonna change.
there's one thing that's been fascinating in terms of doing the research, to your point. And every time I get an assignment like this, I end up researching everything I can possibly research on the topic. And I ended up reviewing literally thousands of communities. And it's fascinating is that although there are best practices that in the public works area, there's a couple different approaches, and they used inclining block approaches and a whole bunch of different ways to approach it. And the part that I found so interesting is even though about 60%, give or take, around the country use the inclining block methodology, where use more, pay more, but use more, pay more, it keeps getting bigger and bigger, and the rates change by 8 to 1. Forget peak, non-peak. And then there's ones that have inclining block and peak, non-peak. Then they have a differentiation between residential and residential commercial. So if you rent your home, you pay more. And you pay more. And it's like a double accounting. But what's interesting is none of the supporting data is consistent in terms of how the accounting is handled and the sources of revenue that were used to develop the infrastructure and the current and future operating expenses. It is all over the map.
I absolutely agree.
And so you end up in a situation where, and I know it's been difficult because we've been holding all these meetings where people say, well, they do it this way here, or they do it this way in Washington, or this way in Virginia. Your head starts to explode.
Yes.
Because when you get down into the details, nothing's consistent. And I think the best example was, I can't remember at the moment, but part of the infrastructure was built by the WPA.
Yeah.
That was 70 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's fully paid for. And yet they're using the funds that are coming in and they're paying everything else within that community.
Yes.
So each one is unique. And I think that in this particular case, as Tony just said, we're a residential community. We happen to have a very large summer impact.
Right.
But if we now look, I've been here, 40 years now. Yeah, it really is. Rehoboth of 40 years ago is a little different now than it was 40 years ago. And the summer, which used to start on Memorial Day, and Sandy Firpo piped it out on Labor Day. Now it starts a couple months earlier and ends a few months later. So conceptually, where's the peak? The peak is changing, the peak is getting more distributed. What does that mean? So really, I'm agreeing and disagreeing with everybody all at the same time.
I understand.
It's an extremely challenging issue, and in the end, you end up making a decision that is based on the philosophy of what your mayor, commissioners, or whatever the regulating body is that's in place. Yeah, and what your fiscal
And
needs are.
I get the economy of scale. I get the 1 meter for all of Hanover instead of 100 meters, and I get having to install 100 meters. That's an excellent argument. I get it. I think you all are doing a great job. I really appreciate it. I really do.
Well, for what we're being paid, I think.
You get what you pay for. Yes, sir.
I think that your statement, the fact that in the past it's not all done equitably, and you're bringing it more into alignment where it needs to be. And I think there needs to be a heavy reminder that the presentation is being made really, although you're letting other people hear it, the intent is for it to be heard by the commissioners, and the other people are welcome to sit into the room. So that's your charge, to advise the commissioners what to do. And whether people like it or not, you may or may not say it is, we're not embarrassed to say what we're saying. We're bringing you what we think is the truth, and we think that we've done a good job, period. Because you have.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I couldn't say it better myself.
I think you tried.
Yeah, try to. Okay, any other comments from the group?
Where does it go now?
So that's our next charge is we have to settle on a date to do the briefing to the working group or a special meeting of the commissioners. That date is being coordinated now.
What's that mean?
We had originally planned to do it Wednesday, the 12th of this month.
Special meeting, what?
The commission, it's a special meeting of the
Special meeting of the
commissioners that we're going to
commissioners.
present to.
Special workshop.
Special workshop.
Open to everyone.
Open to everyone, absolutely. We're trying to schedule that now because we ultimately had some conflict. Right now it's scheduled for Wednesday. Next Wednesday, we're not going to be able to do it because we've got some scheduling issues that have come up. So we're looking to do it now, sometime between now and the 19th of July. So we're going to do a special meeting to the commissioners and the public sometime between now and the 19th. And with the 19th of July, the target to have ready for the commissioners to vote.
I suggest the word is to the commissioners, not with the commissioners.
Sure.
Because it kind of infers it's a separate meeting when you say.
Absolutely not. Yeah, we've learned our lesson. Thank you. It's certainly not our intent. So yeah, so that's kind of the schedule. So as soon as we get that scheduled, then we'll get the meetings posted for everyone. Any other comments from the table?
No.
Great, thanks very much.
How about our schedule?
That's what I'm coordinating with you guys now. You're supposed to send me
Yeah, we
those
just
dates.
responded to that.
Yeah, I think I did respond.
You may have, yeah.
Okay, before you take this down,
Yeah.
can you go back to the chart that Tony was worried about? It's the wastewater, it's the graph, the wide divergence.
Oh, yeah. That was water, right? This one?
Yeah, no,
Right there?
no, that's water, it's a waste.